And we are live, ladies and gentlemen. We are live. Welcome to the Reasonably Fine Art Talk this fine August afternoon. I guess it's morning. It's morning in America. Where our guest today, Mr. Thomas Jefferson Kitts, is joining us from the Pacific Northwest. And Thomas, I gotta say, knows the platform, StreamYard, that we use for the Reasonably Fine Art Talks. And so I'm going to let Thomas really kind of steer on this one. And I'm just going to be back in the peanut gallery. And I will be looking at the comments that people are throwing up on the interwebs. And I will ask, if there are relevant questions, I will ask Thomas of them. But right now, Thomas Jefferson Kitts, where are you exactly?
I'm in Portland, Oregon, sort of what I call the left corner of the U.S.
I've heard of it. I've heard of it up there. Well, it's wonderful you could join us. And the impetus for this was a really interesting thing that you put up on Facebook last week about a 19th century landscape. And without further ado, I'm just going to have your head get really big and I'm going to disappear. Take it away, Thomas.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. For any and all who may be listening, this is just going to be sort of a light talk on an analysis of the painting that Charlie just referenced. And you can see it again on my Facebook page. But bottom line, I think it's a good excuse to talk about composition. How do you construct and move the eye around? So I'm going to jump in. And Charlie, of course, you're going to interrupt. You got to interrupt me. I know you will.
I will. Well, first, I want to know about the dog in the background. We all
you want to know
the dog in the background is alive? Yeah.
Yeah, that's Gus. He is a wire hair mini dachshund, something my lovely wife went out and got. Actually, when I was in Florida after Atlanta, in Florida with you, I was gone too long, so she decided she would go get a friend, and that's the friend.
That's Gus. Okay, well, I can see Gus is really excited about today. Gus is on pins and needles.
Yeah, right. This is okay. Anyway, let's go back on topic here. Okay, so let's kick over to the presentation. So we have pretty pictures to look at. Okay, I'm assuming. Oh, you know what? We have jumped ahead.
Oh, there he goes.
Oh, is he taking off?
No, there you go.
Okay, I'm going to reset this, okay?
It's a well-oiled machine here, ladies and gentlemen, a well-oiled machine.
Yeah, that's why we let the pros do this for real. Okay, so this is sort of the basis of composition for me. Everyone has their own thoughts and processes, but for me, this is why composition is important. To me, composition is the art of leading the eye. We, unlike, say, a movie director, we don't have the luxury of moving pictures over time. We basically have a static image that we need to somehow make compelling enough for viewers to want to look at. And there are things that we can do. There are devices, contrivances, call them what you want, but there are things we can do as we lay out our painting to engage the viewer. Yes,
Thomas, do you think that in the current revival of realism,
yes,
do you how it seems to me that there's a lot of fairly static design.
Oh yeah,
it feels like composition. Just like I love painting with really emphasizing value and edge, and because I think those get underrepresented a lot. And it seems to me that composition is often underrepresented. People just kind of think that by depicting the thing, they've built a painting. And I feel more like they've depicted a thing.
That is a very good point, in my opinion. And I will confess to being one of those people at the beginning of my career. You know, I was into what I think now we can call mimesis, which is it's Greek. It's a fancy word for, gee, that looks just like a photograph. It translates to lifelike or as from nature.
Okay.
And I think most of us, not all of us, start at that point. We start thinking, well, I want to see if I can paint something that's real. And we judge our efforts and we judge our successes by looking at the thing we're painting, the subject, against our painting. And we score ourselves often on how close your painting is to that thing. However, in my opinion, not all, but many people kind of reach that point of facility. And then they think, well, what's next? What do I do?
Mhm.
And that happened to me, actually, maybe 15, 20 years ago. I felt I'd become competent in painting the thing, but what should I try next? And that's when I started looking at these more formal painting issues, like universals that show up at any period, any ism, any time, thinking, well, what if I try that? What if I stop trying to be mimetically accurate and sacrifice some or all of that to produce fill in the blank? And that led me down the road to trying things that weren't necessarily naturalism or realism, some of which we'll get into here. Jump in, by the way, and if
No,
you want to, if
you take it away. I'm all ears, but let's get looking at those pictures.
okay, pictures are always, that's why we're here. Okay, so in that sense, let's see, make sure I'm going in the right direction. Yes, there we go. So here's an example of a painting by Sargent mid-career. It's always intrigued me because of what it did. And I did an analysis of this years ago and threw it up on my blog. And then, of course, I think it even got picked up by Planer Magazine or someone else to publish it. But to me, when I look at Sargent, I look at Sargent not just for his facility and ability to push paint around, but also his compositions, because he is a master, or was a master at it. And what's more interesting to me is that he pushed it. He took the conventions of his time, what was considered acceptable by his society that he operated in, and he pushed them to the point that, not this case, but later when he stopped doing any commissions at all, which was his bread and butter, he really started pushing landscapes and doing experimental things that you would just scratch your head at, going, is this really that guy? But he would also find new ways to resolve these problems, compositional problems that he set up. This is like one of the early ones. The question I have for you, Charlie, and anyone else who's listening is, do you see that this is a self-portrait?
Yes, absolutely. You see the easel and the painter in the mid left-hand side there.
Exactly. Right about 7 o'clock from the center. Yeah. And I look at this painting as a young guy for probably a couple of years before I saw that. But when I did, I was amazed, absolutely amazed that he could capture the light at that moment and make that happen. It enriched it for me. Okay, here's another quote by the other, I have three, I have three painters I venerate. That's Sargent, Sorolla, and Zorn. So I'm going to throw them out here. But this is a great quote, I think, from Sorolla, because I can personally become too caught up in the formal aspects. When an artist begins to count strokes instead of regarding nature, he is lost. This preoccupation with technique at the expense of truth and sincerity is the principal fault I find in much of the work of modern painters. And at that point,
I would posit that that's true of any art form. If you have,
yes,
overly formalistic cinema, it doesn't emotionally engage. If you have overly, writing that is so formally tight, it doesn't have the story truth. It doesn't have the emotional resonance. So
I totally agree with that. And I do, Charlie. And what's interesting when I look at your work, as a friend and a peer, I see this high interest in formalistic issues, but there's always some emotional evoking. That's not the word I wanted, but there's an evocative quality to it that
right.
makes me connect to it. So
that's the goal. I mean, as people who've watched the Reasonably Fine Art Talks know, I love quoting Richard Schmidt saying, the great thing about painting is it lets you see what the world feels like to somebody else.
I have not heard that, but I'm so stealing that. Wow.
Yeah, it's good.
That's beautiful. So here's an example of a typical late career Sorolla painting. But what I want to point out here is when he was courting Clotilda, his then soon-to-be wife, and working for her father in his photo studio, one of his primary jobs was to look at the snapshots that were being taken by thousands and thousands of people. They would just bring the Brownings in, hand over the film, he would develop it, and then he'd print them out. Now, what's interesting to me here is this is an example of where these are people, a whole lot of people, taking and making images with no understanding of the formal issues. They were snapshots, just like your phone is today and Facebook is today. Clearly, his concept or his exposure to the idea of snapshots affected him, because when you look at his compositions, there's sort of a snapshot quality to many of the paintings.
This is the full
full crop.
Huh.
That is, yeah. Everything I show you here is going to be full crop. So that, that's a great point, Charlie. We do need to see the edges so we know what the painter was doing with placement, scale, and all that. But I want to impress upon the listeners, this was a sea change where suddenly the masses with no training at all were able to start producing pictures, photos in this case, but who cares? They didn't spend time carefully arranging things and thinking about it. They wanted to catch their daughter on the beach. And I think that's sort of a pop thing that has sort of pervaded composition. And it's valid. If you ask me, it's totally valid as a cultural motif because it's what the audience does. And what's amazing to me is I already referenced this, but today, the advent of the camera / cell phone and now suddenly being in everybody's pocket, and then the advent of social media, a place where you can fire those images, has impacted the art of image making. And that needs to be thought about.
Yeah.
In my opinion. Okay, so moving on. Now, there's not a lot of quotes by Zorn, so I'm throwing some of this in here, but nothing happens in a painting by accident, not even accidents. This is not from Zorn. I'll admit, this is me. This is my quote. That's why I'm going to say anonymous, because who knows me. The point is, the way I approach painting is nothing happens alone. I either am doing it out of intentiveness or it happens out of inattentiveness, like I'm not paying attention. But also, if you and I are working, I think this is part of your process. Stop me if I'm wrong. But when something happens that you weren't intentionally expecting, you have two choices, which is to remove it, correct it, alter it, or you can look at it and go, I didn't expect that to happen, but I like it. I'm going to leave it alone. In both cases, there's a degree of intentionality. And I think that's part of composition.
Yep.
I can't tell you. I'm sorry. Let me let you in there. What were you going to say?
No, I think that's right. I mean, it's you that is the binary choice. Either you embrace the accident or you remove the accident. So
yeah.
Got it.
So
a second. There's a person here with a question.
Okay.
About getting onto the. It's a technical question about seeing it. If you can see this, Lanny Hofsmann-Halter, you're in the right place. You're seeing we're going to be showing all those images that
yes.
I referenced early on. So you're
yes.
in the right place if you can see this.
Yes, right. And Lonnie, hello. Hey, it's good to hear you. I'm glad you're here. Love talking with you on Facebook, and that's true for anyone else out there. All right, so let's continue on some more pictures. Okay, so here's a painting by Zorn, who, if you think about this is some of the oddest cropping and placements you can come up with. But we have to remember that these artists are working in sort of a modern time where they were trying to avoid the tried and true conventions that have basically held forth since the Renaissance.
So So Zorn and Sorolla are contemporaries.
Contemporary in the sense that they bridged the late 19th century, early 20th century.
Okay, but both of them are dealing with the rise of photography.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah,
Okay.
and that's a very good point. Um, Sargent used a camera, but he didn't paint from
Okay.
photos. As far as we know, that's not the case. Zorn did work from photos, but didn't rely on them. Sorolla, I'm not so sure. I haven't really found the info about that. But you're right. All of these artists are having to contend with this concept of cameras and what they could do. I just want to point out just how quirky and odd. This is full frame. This is not cropped. This is full frame. So we see the placement of the figures. We see the activity that she's doing is no longer really available to us. And then everything's weighted to the left with this big open space to the right. And we're going to talk about that more. And here's finally what I take as a personal credo now, because I don't want anyone to come away from this talk with the idea that Thomas said this, therefore I should do that. What I'm offering here are principles and guidelines. There's no guarantee that they're all going to work every time. So remain open to what you think you need to do in that given circumstance. And know that if you're going to depart from the principle and guidelines, have a reason. At least have, and it doesn't have to be a big reason, just don't do it out of inattentiveness. Just say, okay, I'm going to do that because that's what everyone else does, or I'm going to do that because it isn't what everyone else is doing.
Or
And
I
then,
would say if you do something that everyone else does, and you're doing it just because everyone else does it, do it and then see what you think of it once you've done it. I mean,
yeah,
maybe it'll work for you, and maybe you'll say, well, that's not my authentic voice. And I think our ultimate goal is to be telling our stories as truthfully as we can. And
yeah,
yeah, you gotta kiss a lot of frogs to find your authentic voice, but don't do things just because everybody else is doing them.
yeah. What's that saying? Don't be mediocre. There's too much competition. That's a little dissy. I'm sorry about that, but it's an attitude. I mean, I don't want to shoot for mediocrity. I want to shoot for great. And if I don't hit it, which is often, at least I tried. That's my attitude. Okay. I'll share one more thing. It's a quote, but I don't have it up here. But simply, when I started teaching in 1990, that's that decade where I was running an art department and chairing and developing curriculum and blah 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 blah. I had a very good mentor once tell me, Thomas, never say never, seldom say always. And that's kind of what I'm trying to say here is that be aware of what the principles are, but use them to your purpose. Now, this is one of my paintings, fairly recent. This is a plein air piece. It was a one-off alla prima thing out in Santa Fe. You were there at this convention. But this to me was a challenge because of that damn car, which was actually painted on a piece of plywood cut out and then nailed to the side. I loved everything about this, and it was meant to be a quick sketch. It's since gone on to a nice home. But this guy made chilies, and he sold it through this sort of shed. And I struggled with making that car work. How do I integrate that car? I gave up. I mean, I realized it's not going to happen. Therefore, just let it be what it is.
Well, it ends up being kind of it until you explain that it was a cutout in the scene. It feels very very collage influenced.
Yes.
This out of proportion, out of scale car in this landscape. So okay.
Yes, and why is it floating and all these questions? But I have to tell you, after trying to make it work and then letting go of that, the painting became more interesting to me. It really did. And now I'm not going to get lost in postmodernism and all that, but I'm a big fan of it. And I could see the connection in this sense to that relatively recent ism. But we don't need to go into that right now. I was really just drawn by, again, the use of the religion, the interaction. That's his daughter, by the way, who's coming to say hi and check in. And she was happy to stand there long enough. But the point is, it's a rather discordant painting. It's not one that I would consider pulled together, but that's okay because of where I was. And this, anyway, I'm going to move on. By the way, can you see the cursor moving?
Yes.
Okay, that's going to be helpful. I wasn't sure that was going to happen. All right, so let's go to the analysis of Brangwen's Fowey Harbor, painted in 1887.
Now,
So,
did he have a speech impediment, or was it really called Foley Harbor?
well, I did double check it. It's in English. It's a harbor in I want to say Wales, but that's not right. But anyway, I did double check the spelling several times.
Okay, so it's a real place. Okay.
Right. I know. I kept looking for Foley as in maybe on Cape Ann or something.
Right.
And you have to note the spelling of Harper is not the American one. Anyway, the point is, I actually don't know a lot about Frank Brangwen, other than I realized later that he was a very influential illustrator in his earlier life. And it's worth going to look at his illustrations because you can see how he pulled that sensibility into his fine art stuff. So that's just an aside. I'm going to spend more time looking at his work. I love the fact that he's very shape-based, and it's just such a great example to talk about here. I don't know the size of this, but it feels like it's an easel painting that's maybe, I don't know, 30 by 40 or smaller, but not much when I look at the marks and all that. But let's move on. Okay, so let's start off with identifying where's the center point. Thank you, Cornwall, England. Fantastic. Glad I didn't lay on that Wales thing. Anyway, I'm marking this so you understand where the dead center of this canvas is, because a lot of composition simply has to do with placement. More than that, of course, but where are you putting things? And I'm just calling them shapes. I don't want to get lost in, well, that's a boat, that's water, that's a toy boat, that's sails in the background. I'm going to talk in terms of shapes. And what we see here is the shape of the boat has been placed higher than you might expect in the picture plane. That rectangle is the picture plane. Everything you and I do, Charlie, impacts the picture plane. Whether or not we want to create deep space or shallow space or no space at all into the plane. So in this case, Frank starts off with doing something unusual. However, I'll explain that in a minute. He takes that center thing, the reason the painting exists, which is the characters in the boat, and puts it a little higher center. Okay, that's obvious. Now that line there represents what's called the virtual horizon line. Without going too much into perspective, because I know that causes some people to go, I'm leaving now. I think one of the most important aspects to composing is to figure out where your virtual horizon line is. And do you want to be literal and put it as you see it? Or do you want to do something like Frank did, which is elevate it? He's taken that horizon line, which always, always, always is your eye height, your point of view from your eyes. He's taken it and he's pushed it up. He's taken what should normally be right about here. I know that's halfway, but fact of the matter is your horizon line, your real horizon line will always be cutting halfway between top and bottom. He's taken that horizon line and he's pushed it up high. The question is why? Well, there's two reasons that come to mind. In 1887, there's been this big, by that time, there's been this big influx of what's called Japanisme, which stood for Asian art being imported into France and other parts of Europe. And the way the Asians dictate or determine depth and space was by elevating, taking the horizon line and pushing it close to the top of the rectangle, the picture plane. Okay, have I lost anyone? I hope not. But the thing is, it came from the Asian use of scrolls and screens, which were vertical formats. And look, Frank's painting is a vertical format. Now, this is the thing that really helped to ignite Impressionists, French Impressionists specifically. So if you look at a volume of French Impressionistic paintings, you're going to see right about 1860, 1865, this move of a horizon line to the very top.
Interesting. So in your thesis, or is it generally agreed that that was directly as a result of the Japanese?
Yeah, actually, it's not even my thesis. It's one that I think is the conventional wisdom. There's not anything I'm going to say here that I think is, from me. But it's also interesting that this hit at the same time photography did, and large format cameras could tilt their picture plane. You could actually take the bellows, tilt the plane, or you could take the camera and tilt it downwards, the top of it downwards, and create the same thing in film. And we cannot underestimate that at this point in Western European art culture, a lot of the so-called avant-garde, the people who were supposedly on the edge, they were looking for a different way to indicate space than the classical Renaissance linear perspective. I might get into that more later. We'll see how it goes. But the point is,
I gotta show. Kelvin has done a little research.
thank you.
Says that it is 36.5 by 31.5. So
That's great. That's a good size, man. I love that size range.
there we go.
Thank you. So where I'm going with this is we see right here a huge influence. And by the way, this is a fairly early adopter here who's taking that. We're basing this on one painting. I need to say that. But he's taken this unusual height horizon line, and everything depends on that. Now, I will throw, there could be a rational explanation here. There could be. Frank could be standing on a dock, which means his head is above the boat, which would raise the horizon line. But the fact of the matter is, I think that this has been done in the studio, probably from sketches. It's what I call an assembled painting, and no diss intended with that at all. I'm an ex-illustrator. That's all I did was assemble paintings. But the point is the horizon line is high, and you're going to see why. So in terms of eye flow, most Western eyes, not all, but most of the Western eyes generally are going to start in the upper left and work their way down to the lower right. Now, there are exceptions to this, because if you look at how objects and contrasts and edges, your forte, and value shifts, they can manipulate that and force you to enter the painting from a different part, a different quadrant. But the fact of the matter is, this one seems fairly obvious that it's geared towards, you start at the upper left and you create an S or a Z movement down to the lower right. Now, obviously what's here, the story, the narrative here is about a little boy playing with a boat, in a boat, and the boat's in a harbor. And the boat is also a dinghy, and in the distance are the fuller size, bigger boats. So there's definitely a narrative content here. And everything done compositionally is there to support that story. But that's the movement that most people are going to track, and that's going to be helpful to know. In addition, there's been sort of placements, and this is carefully done. This is not a alla prima, let's go out and paint whatever's there and do it. This has been worked out. You can see there's a lot of triangles that are being used to ultimately direct ourselves to the middle of the boat and then down to the whole point of the painting, which I interpret as the toy boat. It's the relationship of the mom to the boy and the boy to the boat that this is all about. Am I going too fast, too slow? You tell me.
This is good. You're doing good. Yes, you better. That is so important. That keyhole right there. Anyway.
Yes. You, of all people, should spot that immediately, and I bet you did.
I did. I've been biting my tongue until I'm hoping you're going to mention it. Okay, I'll shut up now.
No, thank you for raising this. And the confirmation that you see it too really makes me feel good. That keyhole is so important because to me, it establishes the anchor. You know, the boat is not exactly dead center vertically, and it's oblique. The stern and the bow are turned, but that keyhole, everything, no pun intended, everything keys off of it. It sort of anchors everything around that keyhole to the painting. And this is something I'm going to be playing with myself. I know you do this. You consciously do this. Not every time. Nobody does anything every time. But I see it often in your work. You take a graphic device. It could be a void between two buildings. It could be a building. It could be, I don't know, just some point of focus, or not a point of focus, but some secondary element that is placed dead center. I think I've even seen you put posts, telephone poles, boom, they edit off the top and bottom, and it adds to the graphic strength of your work. It's one of the reasons I love it, to be honest.
The other is because I bribe you. So enough about my work. Let's talk about this more.
Right. Okay. Too much effusiveness, but I want to tell you that I'm a great admirer of your design sense. So we have that keyhole, and I want to point out that there's a whole series of verticals here that sort of combine and compress. They come up in that entry point in the upper left, and then they bring us down to the boat. Oh, keyhole. Somebody asked about the keyhole. If you see right here, I'll take that away in a minute. And you can see this right here. That's the distance between the dock on one side and the bow of the ship on the other.
Yeah,
That's
and we're just calling it the keyhole. I mean, it's a light area of color that serves as a visual anchor in that horizontal band. So, anyway.
Well summarized. Absolutely. And we're going to come back to that towards the end of this. That keyhole is going to be very important. So here we have a series of directional verticals. Now, these verticals are sometimes established by the masts, let's say, of the boats, or the verticals in the building, the verticals of the keyhole. But I want you to understand that the verticals also here are created by alignment. We have the side of the boat here aligning with the reflection here. Now, you would think, yeah, that's obvious. That's what's going to happen. Yes, that is what happens in nature. However, it's also serving a function of getting your eye to track downwards, and look what it lines up with. It lines up with the sail of the boat. Now, if this only happened once in this painting, I would say, well, that's coincidence. Or maybe it really was that way. It wasn't, because who's going to paint a boat in the water like that? But what I'm saying is that the artist, Frank, understood by lining up, which is normally thought as a bad thing, I might add. Most people say, oh, don't line things up, don't create tangents, yada, yada, yada. He's actually using this as a device to get you to flow down to the boat. I'd also point out here is another important alignment. This is the mast of a boat behind, and it lines up right above this boy's head. And you're going to see why shortly. Now, here is, I've been selective. I haven't shown you all the diagonals, but I'm showing you how the diagonals contrast the horizontals and some of the verticals that are in the upper left corner. To give us the sort of emotional sense, the sense that the boat is tipping or it's rocking, he's put these diagonals in the boat. He didn't paint the boat square and flat to the water. He's tilted it. And in the conversation on Facebook, some folks kind of got into, well, the boy doesn't weigh enough to make that happen. I don't know. I mean, I've been in boats with that kind of chine in the hull, where, yeah, I think that could happen, especially if the boy was moving around. It could have tilted briefly for that. But the point is, he wants those diagonals to kind of contrast the static nature of the verticals and horizontals. As most of us have been told, verticals and horizontals are considered more passive, and diagonals are considered more dynamic, or I guess just exciting. And I'll get to that in my own word quickly at some point, because I'm always looking for diagonals. When I go paint, whatever it is, still life, nature, figure, I'm always looking for diagonals. And can I use them? Should I reinforce them? Should I hit them harder than they really are? Should I back off and sort of subdue them? That sort of thing. Now, other than that, now we need to think about the curves, because if you look at all the stuff I've shown you, it's all been diagonals and hard-edged and vertical and horizontal, but the curves are generally reserved for the primary part of the story, the narrative. And obviously, we got the boat, we got the arm of the kid, we got the boat again underneath the hull, and then we have that wonderful line, that very delicate line that the boy's holding on to. So all of these curves are there to kind of get us to travel down to the boat. Would you agree?
I would.
Okay. And then, of course, we have supporting curves, curves that repeat or echo the other sort of curves with a job. Think of it that way. Those curves have a job. And now we have other curves that echo or reflect, no pun intended, those curves. Because if there's anything I've learned, and I'm going to bet you agree, is you want to make sure that the things you have in your painting are in context with other parts of the painting. So if the only curves that existed were these and nowhere else, it would sort of be construed as an oddity as opposed to part of the composition. These curves help integrate or sort of bring those curves into the rest of the painting.
I would also. Oh, good. You're doing the hat. Oh, good.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, you're there now. Okay. Yeah.
All right. So you want to comment, please?
Oh, just that. Well, I'm sure it's the point you're about to make of the hat being kind of a formal shape in the world of formal shapes in that band across the top, and it being the formal shape that leads us into the organic world of the curves. So
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I also want to point out that the boy's head is, well, it's probably not a perfect circle as I've drawn it, but it is very round. It's very circle. It's an ellipses that is facing onto us, literally like my little thing here. It's a circle. But the hat is also a circle as well. It's just tilted in a different plane. So here's the boy's head as a circle. Here's the woman's hat that is now turned, tilted. And, you know, again, it's another reflection or echo, but it's different. And I think that's a beautiful moment. It really, really is when I look at it. Also, I should point out that the boy's head overlaps the edge of the boat, which calls attention, literally calls attention to the boy. You cannot not look at the boy because of that bump of that head breaking the silhouette of the boat. And I meant to start off here. So this is really important. I meant to start off that this painting functions as a series of overlapping shapes. Absolutely everything from the foreground to the middle ground to the background is a series of overlaps. And so that's another way Frank is connecting all these shapes together. And it should not go uncommented on. Okay, now here's me showing you I'm a know-it-all guy. There are some things I would change in this painting, but they're very minor. Very minor. And I've made those changes. This will be on the website already. I talked about this. I didn't think anyone disagreed, which was interesting because on the Facebook page, I really tried not to provide judgment. Like, is this better? Is this worse? You know, did they do this? And, you know, I wanted to hear what other people would say about the painting and then maybe about my analysis. I wasn't trying to convince anyone that I was right and they were wrong. That's a hard thing to pull off, by the way, in social media. So leave that alone. So here's the painting again, no changes, as I started with. Now, these are the changes I've made, and I'll explain why. So if you look at that keyhole right here, I have taken the value of that and just lowered it just a little bit. Just a little bit so that its value is a little darker than the woman's sleeve and the boy's shirt and the boat down here, the toy boat. I did that because I'll show you in a moment, this little notch feels to me, when it's not modified, that it's floating. It's disconnecting from the distant background and coming out in front of the boat. Now that I've suggested that, I think everyone will see it when I show it to you. So all I did in Photoshop was just take it down 1 or 2 points so that it would stay with the rest of the values expressed in this part of the painting. When I did that, her head, her hat, which has a higher contrasting value between the background here and here, her head pops out and the boat itself kind of comes forward. Here, which you'll see, there was a tangent where the ripples or the sort of reflection of the water back here lined right up with the joint where her shoulder, shirt, and vest come together. So tangents, a lot of people know what they are, but a lot of people don't. Tangents tend to completely flatten. When you're trying to position the woman out in front of that distant dock, that tangent was really making it difficult for your eye and mind to position the dock in the distance or the woman in the middle ground. So by taking away the tangent, which you'll see, it kind of unlocked this part of the figure, which then, of course, allowed this part of the boat to come forward. And I did this exact same thing. I forgot to put an arrow here. You'll note that the actual reflection here, it's actually a tangent with that side of the thumb and the string. I pulled it over so that it was further away. And again, same thing. The hand now projects towards us as opposed to there being some confused, ambiguous decision of is the hand closer or is the reflection closer? You'll see this. And then the final two things I did is I took the highlight of this shirt, which was like the keyhole, kind of floating. Disassociating is the term I use. And I kind of knocked down the value so that the value of this reflection of the shirt was darker than the value of the sleeve. Now, in truth, it's one of the few absolutes I throw out there when I'm teaching. And that is that anything that is reflected, any reflection you see is going to be keyed down slightly darker than the object being reflected. And that's because less light bounces off this water, come at us, then comes off of the arm. It is one of the few absolutes. There's a rare case where that isn't always true, but it's so rare I generally don't talk about it unless I can show it. So I darkened this little spot here so that this movement, this connection here to the string, I might add, becomes more important. And then over here, I did something similar with the reflection against the sail. And I did this because one of my commenters on Facebook, there were a few people who couldn't quite see the boat or didn't see the boat because there wasn't enough contrast between the sail and what was around it. So just simple, I didn't change the shape. I didn't change the color. I didn't change the chroma. All I did was change the value. I just keyed it down slightly. And even so, only right here did it go darker. I didn't touch it down here. So now the actual edge of this, and you appreciate this, Charlie, the edge of this sail is more pronounced, and it just strengthens this triangle. That is what this is about. So
are you going to go? Yeah. So this is the original.
Yes, I'm going to flip back and forth. Okay.
Yeah. Good.
So this is me. This is Frank, and you can see. Look at the keyhole. Let's start with that one. Okay, that's me. That's Frank. And you can see why I darkened that keyhole slightly. For all we know, that keyhole literally was that value, and he was spot on. But it's the sort of thing that I would now change. I would depart from Nemesis at that point so that it would stay in the background. Now look at the shoulder, the joint where the shoulder and the vest come together. You can see the tangent there. Now all I've done is I have changed the shape. I've used the same value, but I brought the shape, what would be the edge between the shadow, the edge between the reflection and the water has now been lowered. Oops. You can see it's no longer a tangent. You agree?
I see. Yes, I see.
Now let's go to the boy's hand. Same thing. This is Frank, and you can see that the reflection, the edge between the reflection and the water lines up with his thumb and the string. All I did there was move it over just a touch, just a little bit, just to kind of make that hand a little more clearly out front. Now, I will say, having said that, when I say little minor persnickety, I don't really want you to know I've done this. I don't want this to be so obvious that they go, oh yeah, that's what Thomas did. Yeah, and that's true for my own work. I want to be able to manipulate the image enough to get the thing I want to happen, but not to be so overt that I'm hitting you on the head with a 2x4, that sort of thing. So Frank, me. Now look down at the sail. This is Frank, unaltered, and this is me. My question to you, Charlie, because you're so good at this, is do you disagree with any of that?
It's fascinating. I mean, because in one way, I like to go back to the slot, the keyhole. I like the modern art aspect of having that be that really overt anchor, But
sure,
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying in all of them. I absolutely agree with you on her shirt. The boy's hand that's super interesting. I can see. I kind of like the tangent because it's another little triangle that points to the thumb in his original.
sure.
And I like that kind of that cut in. But I mean, I utterly see the value of what you are doing there. I do agree with you absolutely on the sail in the foreground. The only,
So if
the
I
only
may,
argument against
I'm sorry, you keep going.
the only argument against that would be that it makes it a little more literal to,
Yes,
to
it
have
does
that
do that.
value.
Yeah,
Now,
if I can enter there, just um, I do think there's kind of two kinds of people. Me, I do tend to still lean towards literal in my work, so I'm going to have a preference for that. I'll state that anytime. But then we have people like you who are interested in the further abstraction, and so it does not surprise me that you like the keyhole at that lighter value. And it doesn't surprise me about the boy's hand either, because I do see in your work you often try to flatten space. Everything I made, all the changes I made here was to sort of convey the illusion of depth into the painting. That was my goal. I know when I look at your work, which again I love so much. We gotta talk trade sometime, man. I love so much how you take the natural world and turn it into a graphic thing. And you know what? I think a lot of people miss that. They're not clued in on that necessarily, but it's in the painting, and I love that.
Well, now we have that. I have an interesting comment here. I'm going to show.
Okay.
That you want to take that one, because I always get confused.
Yeah.
I always get confused on those.
Yeah. What's going on there is the golden mean or the Fibonacci series, which I think most of us know about. And I have to say, I take that as a grain of salt. I am not saying artists didn't use it when they laid out their compositions. Some artists relied on that thinking more than others. But I think it's often overexpressed. It's overemphasized that everything somehow falls within the Fibonacci series or the golden mean, when in fact that's just not true. It's a case of where people go out looking for it and they find it and they think, aha, that's it. But that does not contradict what we just saw. You could probably work out the Fibonacci series in this painting, and it's very likely, given the time and place, the artist was using that as a device. It's not something I use myself, but I give the guy credit. Okay.
Okay. Gabrielle says the shoulder tangent looks purposeful in the original. Maybe he had a reason for it.
Yeah, well, fair game, Gabrielle, and good to see you. I hope you're doing well. Yeah, I did imply strongly that all tangents are bad, and I think you were saying with the keyhole and the thumb, no, not always. You're right. I think if your purpose, and Gabrielle, if it's your purpose to flatten that part of your painting, a tangent is probably one of the most powerful ways you can make that happen. And we do see that in contemporary work. We see artists who play with this idea of flattening two-dimensional space. They take 3D space, but they try to flatten it, which is absolutely valid. And yet there's even artists who make part of their painting feel like there's illusionary depth, but they purposely flatten part of it kind of as a foil or as a kind of a joke. So
I like playing with the idea of, yes, that it is a two-dimensional picture plane, and you're trying to get this illusion of depth, but never forget. I mean, that's why I do a lot of kind of half-tone dots and stuff in my paintings. Never forget that this is a two-dimensional representation. So yeah, I like that deliberate flattening. And I would also say what you were just saying about having areas of depth and areas of flatness, that makes actually a wonderful loop back to that painting of the chili stand, because you have that very, very flat car, and then the depth of the figure in front of the stand.
Yeah, I mean, again, I do not disagree with either Gabrielle or you in any way. I just think it's more about the intentionality. Was this something that was happened with consciousness, Or did it just happen and not even noticed? I mean, I see that happen a lot in my students. I just want them to be aware of what tangents do. And by
Exactly.
the way,
Think of it. Yeah. To be
yeah,
aware of it. So
and
Nathan says if you slightly lighten all the background boats, the foreground would have even more depth. Is that
possibly, possibly, I think that the value relationships, the black and white relationships back in here already tend to clump or group or mass all of the objects in there. It's not entirely clear where does one boat start and stop and where do the buildings begin. And I think
Mhm.
that's purposeful. I do think that that's trying to do what our
Yeah.
last comment
Yeah.
called attention to. I think what we do is we reach a point where it's a question of degree, not a difference in kind. You could actually make all of these shapes here one connected, indistinguishable shape. And if it was the right value, it would sit back in space. Or you could lend some information, less than you put in the boat, to tell us what that is, boats, but still keep them separate from, say, the boat in the middle. It comes down to personal preferences of the
Yeah.
artist, I think.
Yeah. No,
So
it's
these are
fascinating.
great.
So much fun. So much fun.
Yeah. I'm going to throw one more thing out, which I wasn't going to say, but if you look at the way the water is treated, and I think you like this, you probably even already thought about it, but think about how the values here and the values here are very close to what we see in the immediate foreground of the water. So Frank is editing, he's taking out ripples, he's taking out contrasts between lights and darks to kind of simplify the immediate foreground. And you have to ask yourself why. And I think the answer is he wants you to kind of feel the boat, the toy boat. He wants you to sort of, if there was all this effort put into painting the water down here, it would diminish the impact, the visual impact of the boat. So that's a case of editing, which we don't talk about enough, I think, as artists. Why do we leave something out? What's the purpose? And that, by the way, I will throw here, and this is where I meant you, is having the value and hue and chroma so similar down here to what happens up here, it creates a vertical plane. Instead of the near water kind of coming out as a flat plane projecting to us,
Mhm.
it tips the water up. And that's also an Asian thing. If you look at Hokusai, Hiroshige, those are Japanese printmakers, they're totally doing this. It becomes more, well, at the time it was considered more decorative in a dismissive way. But today people do it often without understanding where it comes from. They just like it. And just, hey,
Yeah.
there we are. I'm going
Yeah.
to shift gears here. How are we doing on time?
We're long, but let's go on. Let's do your final act here.
All right. Well, Act B is my work. And I'm just going to briefly talk about what I was trying to pursue compositionally with that piece. Okay. So this is a fairly recent painting, three Irish boats. And I was interested in going from this flat plane that the water is, that the boat sat on, into the distance, into the upright planes of the foliage. So basically it's this and then that. And I was also interested in seeing if I could make the softness of the foliage in the background work as a vertical plane. And then when you close up, you can see sides and top planes there as well. So the water itself is a top plane. It's facing the sky.
Mhm.
Everything inside the boat is top plane or side plane. So I'm trying to integrate that. Fairly literal. Now, this is a very recent one. When I was in Sicily a month and a half ago, this was a painting where it was terrible light. There was no directionality to it. I made up that shadow. It was in the morning, but I wanted to play this concept of moving from cool neutrals in the foreground into this warm sandstone in this, in the actual upright part of it. And I wanted to repeat or echo. Those pillars are echoed by the trees. That's what I was thinking about. And I was also looking at how the sky, instead of it treating it as a flat shape, what could I do to make this different as a hue than this up here? And I wanted to play off warm and cools in this painting. But design-wise, I'd say the pillars and the trees were very important. Oh, I'd also throw down that the pillars are upright, but down below, this is all just sort of the rocks and the stones and things lying down. So just like that boy's head and a woman's hat, they're similar in shape, but because they've turned in space differently, they're different. This is a head study I did of one of my lovely models that this is the girl I used for the Sargent painting, the young girl. I call her Lulu because we don't like to, oh, good question. Those are both 16 by 12, rather small. So great question. I'm interested in sort of leading the eye, refining, let's say, the facial features of this child, but also coming out and just expressing paint. Not unlike Jackson Pollock, who was only interested in expressing paint. I'm not saying this is a Pollocky thing. I'm just saying that Pollock and a lot of the AE abstract expressionists were interested in the properties of paint. That's what their paintings were about. That's what I'm doing when I kind of move out from the head or into the negative shapes along the periphery. I was also, I might add, very interested in the repeat between the hoop earrings and her little red hairband. And in general, the roundness of her face, her eye sockets, her nose, the earrings, the shoulder, the hairline, all of that is what I call echoing. I used to call it repeating, but then people thought, well, does that mean I'm supposed to make them exactly the same? No, right. These are echoes of each other. Always something changing. I have a saying, by the way, same, bad, bad. So anytime you find yourself repeating anything, it could be objects, shapes, it could be values, it could be colors, it could be thickness versus thinness of paint, it could be large and small. Anytime you repeat two things, two exactly, I think it's worth stopping and considering, should I do that? Because nature doesn't give us repeats exactly. There's always something different, no matter what. Might be minor, might be major, but if you saw two telephone poles in a line come back in 20 years, one of those telephone poles is not going to be the same as the other. Right. So same, bad, bad. Now here's a very literal depiction of a still life, and I was after that. But I want to point out that we have these peonies, which have a rounded sort of dish-like form. We have the shoulder of the pot, the green pot, which is also a circle, but it's tipped horizontal. And then we have the onion, we have the lemon, and we have the bottom of the pot. But I'll tell you, as I was painting this became to me very, very interesting because of its abstract quality. I'm kind of like Richard in the sense that if I catch the abstraction of my subject well enough, then I will end up with the subject being depicted, but also I can hang on to some of the abstraction. I don't have to be so literal that I paint every leaf clearly. That's the part of the painting that I ultimately became interested in. I'll throw out that little dab of yellow there, which is coming from the lemon below, and it was there, I might add. It's something I spotted and I thought, oh, that's the scale of that, the smallness, the change of hue, blah, blah, blah. I got to do that. And that's why I ended up doing that. You don't even see it or necessarily become aware of it at this scale unless it's pointed out to you.
Well, I think it's very important because if it wasn't there and if the yellow above the peony in the upper center, above, so up, yeah, you're getting there. Keep moving that, keep going up, a little to the left. There we go, right there. I think that has to be there, and those and the yellow on the pot. To otherwise, that lemon would just be so isolated. This is color world. This alien would be the alien being.
Yes, in fact, you'll see me trying to integrate it right here too. Again, this is naturalism. It was there, but you can see it just the barest reflection of that yellow there. And that's what I call a bridge. That's literally kind of connecting this to that through that color shift. It's a hue shift, not necessarily a value shift. Well, it is a value shift. But the point is, I'm always looking for color returns is the term I use, where you see the same color, but differently elsewhere in the painting. or you see a combination. It could be a transition between two hues or something that stitches together the painting. I think that's well observed. Thank you. Let's keep going. Now this is a plein air piece. This is an orchard near my house. The blossoms were out. It's an apple orchard. I love this because it's very abstract. The subject matter itself is inherently abstract. And I had to run this risk of becoming too literal. But I caught the point where the blossoms were dropping. I loved how the repeat was the blossoms in the tree and the blossoms on the ground. And that's the whole, and the fact that these very strange, macabre looking branches, these are not well trimmed orchards. This is a pioneer orchard that is rarely ever dealt with. The way that those trees would recede into space. And I might add, right there is your visual horizon line. So all the bottom of those trees are sort of stepping up into the horizon line. One of my favorite paintings of that year, I just haven't done anything with it. Now, this is very recent. I'm painting for a show, a museum show in 2024. And the theme of the show is the Columbia River, from the Snake River, mouth of the Snake River, all the way down to the Pacific Ocean. So this is one of the side rivers, the Klickitat, where these Indians fish. They dip net. And this is plein air. I went out there and set up and they were working. I've always wanted to catch this subject and just hit it right, absolutely right this year. But I love how, again, I'm thinking Asian-wise. I'm actually standing up on the bank. That puts my horizon line quite high up. It's probably somewhere in this area here. The vertical horizon line, meaning you can't see it. But that means the foreground gets tipped downwards, and you're seeing the very top of one of the fishing platforms here. And then you're looking down on the water here versus out at the water here. To me, this is perfectly Asian in that sensibility.
Now, it's nice. One thing I would point out on that is the scaling of the brushwork, of the big brushwork in the foreground, and then you proportionately scale it back as you move back, as the eye moves back in the painting.
Again, very well observed, and that was intentional on my part. Yeah, the scale of our marks, if we were trying to give the illusion of distance, you're right. There's a progression of shape / brush marks that go from big to small. Now, that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is, and I don't have an example up yet, maybe it'll come up. We tend to see a very small area of focus. Our human eyes are built in such a way that you have about, if you hold your arm out at arm's length, your area of focus is about the size of your thumbnail. And if anyone doesn't believe that, try it. Stick your arm out, line things up, and then start to move out from the thumbnail, and you'll see how quickly things start to go soft, soft. So blurring happens, loss of contrast between lights and darks happen, your inability to distinguish what is an edge goes away. And that's what I was trying to do here to some degree.
And that is also something that people don't realize when they're painting from photos.
Yes.
The camera is so honest and trying to show, here's this, and this is important, and this is important, and this is important. It's just not how we see. So you have
absolutely
stiff paintings done from photos.
Yeah, because what happens, and you know this, I'm not really talking to you about this, but what happens is when we're working from a monitor or from a photograph, a print, is we scan. We're like looking at, okay, I'm going to paint over here. Okay, I'm done. I'm going to go paint over here. Oh, I'm going to paint over here now. We don't really look, like this area in relationship to that area,
right,
naturally. But that's how we see. I don't remember what it's called, but our eyes are constantly flicking about. And I think it's on the order of, you're not aware of this, but your eye is sort of taking in little vignettes on the order of like 30 to 40 times a second. You're not, even if you stare at something, you're moving your eyes to the side slightly. And when you do, several things happen. Now, these little vignettes that your eye is scanning for, this is how it evolved. It gets assembled in our brain. And so in our brain, we have this idea of the gestalt, the whole thing. But the fact of the matter is we're seeing little bits.
Right.
That's what we're looking at. You know who figured this out in a beautiful way was David Hockney and his Polaroids. And you probably get this reference. But if you go back and look at David Hockney's Polaroid series in the early 70s, he takes a Polaroid camera and goes like this. The camera never moves. It's still centered, but he's turning the camera lens. And then he takes all those Polaroids and he kind of creates a mosaic. He tries to get the scene lined up. And what you start to see is things don't line up. Edges of roads, tree trunks, clouds. There's just a little jog. And all he's doing is turning the center of the lens. And that is actually how we see, bottom line.
Right.
And that, by the way, explains, I'm kind of going off the res here, but that does explain when you look at a Cezanne still life and you look at the table along the back. Oh, you like that? All right. Anyway, when you look at the back edge of a table in a Cezanne still life, you often find instead of this, you see this, or you see that. And a lot of people look at that and they think, oh, that guy couldn't draw. No, he was actually painting what he saw, because just like that thumb thing, if you keep your head still, don't move your head, but you move your directional gaze, just turn your eyes without moving your head, the perspective, the convergence you are looking at changes as well. And that explains why his tables are doing this. If you don't believe me, folks, try. Just do it, and you'll see it. So this concept that we see exactly as things are isn't true. And that's just one. But I'm going to move on. Okay, so there's a close-up, shows the brushwork, yada, 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 one cool. Hard edge, lost edge. That was a large part of this composition. As you know, if you give us an edge, people are going to look at it. If you diminish or eradicate an edge, people won't look or readily look at that area. And that can be a compositional tool. Where do you want me to go with my eyeballs? Well, high contrast, hard edges are a good way to make that happen. Not the only, but a good way. Now,
Thus the squeegee. Thus the squeegee, Thomas.
Yes, you know, I love your squeegee. Absolutely.
Okay, go.
Same thing I would add too, and this may not be sort of what you're doing, but in addition to that, for those who like to paint thicker, areas that are thicker, more impasto, tend to gain more prominence or importance than areas that are painted thinly. So you can play that. That's a contrast, just as light and dark, big, small, cropping, not cropped. How thick the paint is versus how thin the paint is. Is it opaque? Is it transparent? Anytime there's a polar opposite that you can play and use, by all means, jump in there, because that's part of the composing. So now this is an example of, this was a studio piece from a photo where I was kind of scanning everything and painting it fairly equally. But I was interested in the repetition of the boulders, the actual Washington palm, the vegetation, the light that was scanning the hills outside of Borrego. You know, there was sort of like this repeating form. In some cases, I think it got a little too repetitive, because this is a very literal depiction of the photo reference. I think if I were to do this again, or I might even pull this out, it's still in my studio, I might want to sort of change the repetition. Some of it is too same to me, but I wanted to show you how we have this organic form, the brushiness of the skirt of the Washington palm against the upward lift of the dry grass. And you got the pattern of the white rocks, and you got the sort of distant light hitting the hills and all that. That's what I was interested in as a composition. Okay. Moving on. This is an alla prima one-shot deal. I went down to a local food court and started painting 11 p.m. I really had fun with this, because all I wanted to make happen was that recession into the murk, into the darkness. And that was accomplished by chroma and value shifts and grouping and massing. You can see things become closer in value as we go into the distance. Yes, there's convergence of the curb along the bottom of the cart. You got your verticals there for you, Charlie. That's meant to kind of contrast the diagonals into the space, that's actually the painting surface. That's actually right here in the painting. Now this puts you, your nose is now maybe 2 inches off the painting, but you can see I'm not trying to render here. I'm trying to use hue value chroma and placement and convergence to give the illusion of depth. I'm not trying to render. I want the color and shape and form to do the work. Here's a quirky thing I'm throwing in. This is a sorry little bird who slammed into one of our kitchen windows. He died on the spot. I looked at that and I thought, oh, I need to paint that. And I put it down on a piece of white canvas thinking, well, what am I going to do with this? And I thought, I don't need to do anything because the openness, the emptiness around this deceased bird, all Monty Python jokes aside, I think became part of the statement, that there's nothing around it. This bird is alone. And so I left it that way. And there you can see how the contrast here is all the brushy nature of the paint set against the sort of open expanse of the white. That's a contrast. More marks, more rendering, less marks, less rendering. Here's a big piece for me. I mean, I work larger, of course, but this is 24 by 48. I started this one on site with my friend Tim, the guy we talked about, the guy in the crazy hat in the painting. You'll see at the end. Anyway, where I'm going with this is that I was very, very caught up in that light, the diagonal nature of the light that was just rising. This is early morning. That light didn't last very long. I did work this in the studio a few times, mostly without photos. We just sort of looked at what was happening and worked the shapes, much like Monet would work Chartres Cathedral series. He'd go out there and he'd capture the statement, then he'd bring it in the studio, work it, then he'd take the painting back out and work on the painting, then he'd bring it in the studio. He wouldn't work from photos. He would just go back and forth, sometimes with the aid of the subject in front of him, sometimes without. I'm interested in that kind of working myself now. I'm not crazy about photos for the reasons you express, and I will resort to photography references if I have to. Here's a watercolor, something that's fairly new for me to come back to. I just love the shapes.
Yeah.
I mean, I want the abstraction to speak. I still want people to understand what they're looking at, but I want the abstraction walking that line between what's real, what's not. Another night scene, same time I did that food court thing. This is a fair that comes basically downtown Portland, and I've always wanted to paint it at night, and there it is. This is a plein air painting as well, painted up at about 8,000 feet on Mount Hood. End of the day, incredibly cold. It was January. I just had to keep things simple and just play with shapes. And that's important. That's why I put this up here. I'm thinking about shapes. I'm not thinking about trees, snows, logs, mountains, sky. I'm literally thinking, what is the shape? Where do I want to put it? How do I want to crop or edit it? I don't want to be having in my head, oh, it's time to paint the snow now. Time to paint the snow in the shadow now. Time to paint the sky. Blah, blah, blah. I just want to respond to the shapes. And that's a 9 by 12. Here's a 16 by 20 of my friend Tim, the guy in the boat. We went out painting at a nursery once. And again, I wanted to pick the focus. And obviously in this painting, the focus is the hat and the hair. Okay, that's the point. Everyone knows Tim. Tim is probably one of the most painted people I know in my part of the world. Everybody's done it. But also, I'm giving you multiple area foci. People often say, well, you should only have one point of focus. No, you probably need to have a dominant point of focus, in this case, the hat and the face and the hair. You probably need that. But you can also sprinkle secondary or tertiary areas of focus so that the eye will move around. And when I look at this, my goal, my attempt here was to kind of get you to cycle from this. Everyone's going to look at the head. And this is an example of high contrast with hard edges being played off of softer edges or non-existent edges. This is your Richard Schmidt thing. I don't do it as well as he ever did. God forbid. I'd love to do that as well as he did. But I was thinking about him when I was painting this. Right here, I give you, you see this dark here? That's just, I mean, the whole shrub behind him was that dark. But I didn't want to make it as dark over here because then that would take you away from what I wanted you to look at. So I just provided a patch of that dark there. And you can see I'm doing it here. See I'm doing it here. You can see you've got an edge here that leads you in. You got this when this happened, this was a real aha moment to me. When I saw this, I thought, oh my God, that has got to go in. To see that light on his calf, on the back of his thigh, and see it echoed or repeated up here, yada, yada, yada. I'm torn between whether or not the value contrast here should be lessened. I can certainly
I know, I like that. I like that. I like that very much because it moves up there, then down at the base of the easel, and then down at his foot. I mean, it keeps moving around.
And honestly, I think you're right. It does. I guess what I'm trying to say here is this doesn't have to represent anything. It doesn't have to represent leaves in light and leaves in shadow. It just needs to be a shape to do what you just said, to pull the eye over here so that then it can return over here.
Right.
That's what I was thinking at the time. And then we have the little things like that little spot of blue, which was there on his palette, but I hit it a little extra hard because I wanted like that yellow dot in the flower painting. I wanted that to kind of activate the neutrals in the area. Yada, 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 yada. I keep talking like that. But this happened very quickly. I think I had about an hour to put it out there. And he was very kind to, I mean, he was working. But the point is, there was no time for me to orchestrate or to anticipate or to refine. I haven't painted on this at all since I painted it. And I won't, especially since you like that area to the left. So I don't want people to come away from this conversation thinking that, oh, absolutely everything should be as equally considered out on plein air as in the studio, because I don't know if that's rational or doable. Maybe for some. Actually, there are a couple painters that we know that have stunned me with that. But the point is, I got my outdoor stuff, and that's what this is, and I got my indoor stuff where I have more leisure to contemplate. Right. We're getting fairly close to the end here. This is another watercolor, one of the few that I mean, I don't know if I'll ever sell this. I broke every compositional rule in the book with this one, but it works for me. And it certainly seems to work for anyone else who looks at it. You know, here I have divided the rectangle in half. I got this big open space out here, which I hint at shapes through the clouds and through the top of the water. But for some reason, this still works for me. You know, I think it may have to do with the diagonals of these trees pushing out and almost feeling like they would drop down into the water, which they will do someday. That tree will fall into the water. But there's something about all the contrast here has been loaded on the side, kind of like the Zorn painting of the child that I showed you. But having this take you out here, and then this little bit here, which I wasn't purposely doing it. I didn't set out to say, I'm going to put clouds there. I just put them in there and realized this is a found thing, that having that kind of information in this part of the painting connected to the palms, fronds, and connected to the shapes. In fact, there's overlap right there.
Right.
Just like the Brangwyn painting, overlap is your friend. In many cases, taking shapes and overlapping them is a great way to stitch a painting together. Here's a more refined studio piece. Yes, this was from a photo. I did paint it live, but I was interested in the whites, how the whites could kind of move around, how we had diagonals in the folds of the shadow versus the light, how the inside of her arms would be, you know, one arm would be in the dark, one would be in light, how we'd have these flowers both be in shadow and in light. I think if I ever mess with this, I'm going to do something over here which might pull the eye back. I don't know what it would be yet, but I might. I don't know about you, Charlie, but I do have paintings that have been sitting around for years. I look at and I go, oh, yeah, now I know what to do.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Here's another watercolor. This is up on this is Cannon Beach, or close to Cannon Beach in Pacific Coast, Oregon. I was looking at the wave patterns and the distance between the two and the shapes. You know, they're not lined up in perfect parallel. And then I was also like, how do I carry these shapes of the water into the landmass? And so again, this is flat top plane. These are side and top planes here. And also, how do I bring the eye out into the distant water here, but not such a way that these rocks seal the show from this part of the painting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm trying to use value contrast in areas I want to be more important and more edges there within what I can do in watercolor, because I do okay in watercolor, but I am no master at it.
Well, I think your watercolors are fascinating. So,
Well, I love them. I love them so because I've reserved that medium for my old age, and I think I'm approaching that now. I absolutely love what Sargent said when he was asked at his first show of watercolors by an art reporter. He said, "Well, Mr. Sargent, so this seems new. What do you like? What do you like about watercolors?" So no, actually, what he said was, "What do you think of watercolors?" And Sargent's reply was, "It's making the best of an emergency."
right. I love that quote.
Oh my God. It allows me to try things. Okay, I didn't know you know that. Okay, this is another studio piece. I think this is 30 by 40. I painted this from life twice, actually. And then I thought this would make a great piece. So I just articulated the hell out of it. I mean, I love the painting, the light dark combination of the bark against all this stuff. All of that was part of why I was drawn to it. But honestly, I got lost in the nigglies, in the leaves. I think I may just try this one again and really simplify the leaf masses. There's a point, I think, where you can show a shape of the leaves, but then show some of the leaves within that so that it still reads like a shape.
Right.
And I went way past that. Although it's a popular painting,
Right.
definitely.
It doesn't mean people aren't going to like it. So, I mean, sometimes I overshoot, and it's not my favorite painting, but I know it's going to, it's going to be popular. People are going to like it, and then you just go back and try to land the plane in the place you wanted to land the plane the next time.
Well, again, you know how much I admire your work, and one of the things I do like is how you pick out selective areas to give us more information, and then you give us sort of a balance or an opposite of that in other areas where you don't. And that is one of the things that makes it different from what we see in a very beautiful way. So I might be trying to take your page out of your book on that one.
All right. Well, we have to
Okay.
stop soon because my friend Ezra is here to install the new light over my stove. So
Okay.
he's walking around the block right now. Two more.
All right. Two more. This is a plein air piece, 30 by 40. It's about 6 or 7 times I went in there. It's about a 3-mile hike. This is me in my environment. This is where I live. And God knows if you come out my way and want to go paint, I'm going to take you here. To me, this is where you look at the awesomeness of nature, and it's small scale. It's not like the Grand Canyon, but you look at just how complex nature really is, and you try to find ways to put it together that don't look too labored. I still love this painting. It's still in the house. I also love the fact that I was carrying this 30 by 40 painting back into the bush, so to speak. And
the thing I like about this is the shape, the repetition of the kind of cascading shape of the water in the foreground is also echoed in the air and the rocks in the background. It has that's nice.
Thank you. I really appreciate hearing that, because that is one of the things I set out to do. I will say that this is I don't know how it looks on your monitor or anyone else's monitor, but in this painting, my whites here became so absolute white that they tend to flatten the space. So I may go back in and modify within like 2 or 3 percentage points in some of these whites, just to kind of, again, reinforce the illusion of space and depth. That's kind of what I'm about mostly. The same way I changed the reflection of the boy's arm and the woman's shirt to kind of make things sit further in or pull further out. I think I may revisit this, but I won't change much, not much at all. This takes us to the last painting. I'm going to throw this out here because I'm curious what you have to say. This is a painting. It's maybe 70% of where it is now, but I didn't shoot a new shot. But I have been struggling because the boat and the figures in the boat come from one photographic reference. This is supposed to represent Hudson Bay Company operating on the Columbia River. The photo actually was taken up on the Fraser River in BC, but Tim gave it to me and it was good enough to work from. So I blocked it in, and in the background, that's a very recognizable part of the Columbia River. And I had to deal with the fact that this is the photo I had to deal with. I couldn't change the photo significantly because I just didn't know enough about these subject matter. So I had to kind of design with that in place. Now, the trouble I'm having, and I'm going to get your opinion, is to try to get like the shape here of the water, and Columbia is very wide at this point, is how do I get from this part in the near foreground to the distant foreground?
You got to. I have an immediate response.
Please.
If you want it.
Yeah, I do.
The black comma shape of the front of the boat. Yeah, that's where that's the clam note to me. That's the off note, because it ends up folding back on itself. I think because it's such a definite black line. It makes the prow of the boat bend back into the water form. I think you got to break that up a little bit, or else mess with the value a bit.
I will definitely consider that because I hadn't thought about that, but I see your point. It becomes kind of this graphic shape down here.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, it's like a barrier. It doesn't let the eye come around the bow of the canoe into the water. So I'm going to look at that today.
Think about that. I interrupted you. You were
No. I really wanted to hear what you said, and I think it's very valid. I'm going to look at that. I may even combine it with, I think, the way I'm going to resolve that. And that is I'm going to take some of the value you see here and start with that on this side of the boat. And then I'll sort of lighten the contrast as we move into the distant water. That would alleviate the contrast between this stitching, which you are commenting on, and this water. I think I may have to do both. I may have to actually darken this side of the water a bit. And then I think if that doesn't do it enough, then I'm going to do exactly what you said, which is I'm going to lie in the sense that this black will not be true to the reference. It'll just be reduced lighter in value to make the eye cross over.
Cool.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm going to make our heads big again.
Okay.
Are you ready to?
I am. Yes. Take it away. I have one quick tip when you do that. I want to show. Okay. Oh, I got to go back to. No, I can change on my side. Come on. All right. So here's my tip. The takeaway for those goes straight to the fried egg. Yes, I love that. It is a fried egg. Now
I hate it when people in workshops all of a sudden start seeing shapes, because then we all start seeing shapes. So
yeah. It's now actually an emblem, and that's a beaver, a silhouette of a beaver that's historically accurate on there. But you know what? I will post this puppy for everyone to see on Facebook, and it needs to be finished up shortly. But here's the tip. Oh, by the way, and again, thank you for saying that, because it reinforces my need to make a change to the egg. Here's what I do a lot of, whether I'm outside or inside, is I will, and people who've taken my classes know this, I will look at my painting or someone else's painting, and I will do this. I will cover some part of that painting with my hand. And by doing that, if that area is troubling me, and I cover it with my hand, I'm more easily able to understand what has to happen in that area. It's sort of easier to figure it out than if I just look at the whole painting. If I do this, I can see the rest of the painting, and I can also imagine what happens here. And I think that's invaluable. Please, everybody give that a shot. See if it works. Okay? Okay, my presentation's done.
So. All right. Well, Thomas, this has been wonderful. I could easily, and I think people would love it if this conversation continued. I think you should come back at some point in the next, in the next year or so, and we can discuss how that painting resolved. And I want to see where you're going to go with in watercolors in your dotage, because I think you've got a real facility for that. So this has been great fun.
All right. Well, I've enjoyed it too. I certainly have, and thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to do this.
Absolutely. You take good care, Thomas, and all of you out there in internet land, you take good care too. Next week, we're going to have the great Laurie Putnam join us, which is going to be big fun. So, all right. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye now.